We trust healthcare professionals with the people we love most, right? Our parents, our grandparents, our children. It's a sacred kind of trust. But what happens when that trust is completely shattered? Today, we're going to tackle a really difficult but absolutely critical topic. What happens when caregivers cause harm, or worse, right inside our healthcare system?
It really leads to a chilling question: who guards the guardians? When caregivers themselves become the source of danger, who is there to protect the patients? That's really the central question we're going to dig into today. So let's get started.
Researchers actually have a name for this kind of predator, and it is absolutely bone-chilling. They call them custodial killers. And just think about that for a second. These are people who use their position of trust as a caregiver to commit the worst crimes imaginable. And they do it in plain sight, in the very places we believe are the safest.
All right, to really understand just how high the stakes are here, we're going to start with the most extreme examples. You've probably heard the media use a certain label for these cases. They call them angels of death. And look, this is not something out of a thriller novel. The convictions of nurses like Victorino Ochoa and Lucy Letby, these are very real, documented cases. It's a recognized criminal phenomenon. They literally use their medical knowledge and their access as weapons to become serial murderers, preying on the most helpless people in their care. Okay, so these individual cases are absolutely terrifying. But here's the thing. By studying them, researchers have actually found a recognizable profile. When you step back and look at the data, a distinct pattern starts to emerge. So, what are we talking about exactly? Well, researchers have a really clear definition. A healthcare serial killer is a nurse who has been convicted of at least 2 murders that were carried out inside a hospital. And having this specific definition is so important because it allows for a real forensic analysis that goes way beyond just the sensational headlines. And the data from that analysis, well, it challenges a pretty common stereotype. I mean, when you think of serial killers, you probably picture a man, right? And for the most part, that's true. But in this specific category, convicted healthcare killers, a study found that a slight majority, 56%, were actually female. This really gets to the heart of how they weaponize their profession. The most common methods used? Insulin and muscle relaxants. Think about it. These are substances that are readily available to them, they're difficult to detect, and they can make a death look like it was from natural causes. The very tools they're supposed to use for healing become their tools for murder. But maybe the most shocking statistic of all is this one. Nearly half, 44%, of these killers murdered between 5 and 9 victims before they were caught. Let that sink in. This points to a profound failure in the system to spot these patterns and protect patients. It just allowed the horror to continue, completely unchecked. So, intentional murder is obviously the most extreme end of the spectrum, but it really points to a much larger systemic problem. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to move from the killers themselves to the system that allows them to operate. A system riddled with loopholes and neglect that lets dangerous people slip into these positions of trust. And you don't have to take my word for it. This quote comes directly from testimony given by the Office of the Inspector General before the U.S. Senate. It's such a blunt assessment. They said, fundamental common sense safeguards are lacking. The problem isn't that we need some super complex solution, it's that we're failing to implement basic common sense protections. And that same testimony revealed 2 absolutely massive gaps in the system. First, you've got what's called the Medicare loophole. Basically, state Medicaid programs can just skip a background check on a provider if they're already enrolled in Medicare. But here's the catch. Medicare might never have done a background check in the first place. And then there's the ownership loophole. Criminals can hide their involvement in a facility behind these really complex ownership structures, and states often just don't verify who the real owners are. For any family out there, this means you can't always trust a facility's credentials at face value. But, it goes beyond just faulty background checks. There's an even bigger problem here. A total failure to track, investigate, and respond to abuse and neglect, even when someone actually reports it. This is really where the system's defenses just completely break down. Just take a look at this chart. It shows a really worrying trend. Between 2009 and 2018, the number of complaints of potential abuse that facilities themselves reported to CMS, that's the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, just kept going up and up and up. The alarm bells were ringing, louder and more often year after year. And incredibly, those numbers aren't even the full story. Not by a long shot. In a single year, 2016, an Inspector General analysis of Medicare claims from hospital ERs found thousands of potential abuse cases that were never even reported to the authorities like they were supposed to be. And as you can see from this map, this isn't a localized issue. This is a nationwide problem. So the Inspector General's office came up with what seems like a pretty simple solution, right? They said, hey, let's use the government's own Medicare data to help us spot these red flags. It makes sense. But according to that same testimony, CMS, the very agency in charge, did not concur. They basically just rejected the recommendation. So, all of this, it leads to a huge national debate. It basically puts the entire system on trial. You've got government watchdogs, you've got industry groups, and you've got patient advocates. They all see the problems, but boy, do they disagree sharply on how to fix them.
And a major point of conflict is staffing. On one side, you have industry groups saying there's a crippling workforce shortage and it's just incredibly hard to fill positions. But on the other side, you have patient advocates who argue that the link between low staffing levels and poor quality of care is well documented, and they are demanding mandatory, enforceable, minimum staffing levels.
And while that debate rages on, this is the reality on the ground. According to the Inspector General, as many as 1 in every 3 nursing home residents may experience harm. And here's the most damning part. More than half of those cases are preventable. We're not talking about unavoidable accidents here. This is about a fundamental failure to provide basic, safe care. So, we really end up right back where we started. This is so much more than just numbers on a chart. It's about a fundamental, heartbreaking breach of trust. The data is clear. The loopholes have been exposed. The only question that's left is, what are we going to do about it?